What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're looking at a brilliant Chess.com rapid game played between the GOAT Magnus Carlsen and his new rival Alireza Firouzja on February 7th, 2024. And here we go. In the game, Magnus opens 1d4, Alireza goes knight to f6, and then on move 2 here, Magnus, he busts out the disrespect with the move bishop g5, the Trompowsky opening, putting immediate pressure on that knight on f6, and sure enough, white is technically threatening bishop takes f6, but overall, it's not that scary, and you simply don't see the Trompowsky at the highest level very often, unless you are literally Magnus Carlsen trying to dish out disrespect on your opponent. All right, now here, Alireza, he came ready. He plays the strongest line as black. That is simply d5, followed by the move c5, and it turns out this d5 then c5 plan is apparently the strongest line according to Stockfish. This is what all the top players play nowadays, and the idea being you're just not that worried about bishop takes f6. Regardless of how you recapture g takes or e takes, you will be doing just fine, as you will have the bishop pair if white goes for that. Now here, white has many different options. Bishop takes is playable. You can go knight d2, knight c3, knight f3, c3 if I can draw arrows correctly, and so on. In the game, white does go knight to d2, an interesting choice. And now here, black as well has many options. You can go queen b6, putting pressure on b2. You can go e6, intending, say, bishop e7 and short castles and so on. Or in the game, you can go knight c6 like Alireza Firouzja. Now here, Magnus, he goes c3, getting that beautiful pawn triangle in the center. And now here, Alireza, he does trade on d4, c takes d4, then e takes d4. And now here again, he's got many different choices. But the main idea behind this line, where you go for an early knight c6 and then c takes d4, getting a reversed Carlsbad structure, is to go bishop f5 or g4, then e6, getting your light squared bishop outside the pawn chain before blocking it in. Now, before doing that, here Alireza, he does go h6, putting pressure on the bishop on g5. The bishop must move. Where is it going to go? Well, it turns out bishop takes f6 is actually not a good move. Black can just recapture with the g-pawn. G takes f6, and again, it turns out having those two b's on f8 and c8 matter more than the damaged pawn structure on the king side. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he is going to retreat. You can go to f4 or h4. Both moves are playable. In the game, bishop h4 was played, and now here Alireza, sure enough, bishop f5, getting that light square bishop outside the pawn chain before going e6, and overall, black is going to have a perfectly fine game. Now here, white has some tricky options. For example, queen to f3, putting immediate pressure on the bishop is playable, believe it or not. But instead, here, Magnus, he does keep it very simple with the move knight g to f3, perhaps intending bishop b2, short castles, and so on, with a fine game as white. Now here, Alireza, he goes e6, again intending maybe bishop d6 or e7, then short castles. And now white goes bishop b2, and then sure enough here, bishop d6 for black. Now, I do want to point out the computer finds many other ideas instead of that. For example, the immediate g5, intending bishop g3, and then knight to h5, chasing the bishop and winning the bishop pair is the strongest line, and there are many other options as well, but instead, in the game, bishop d6 played by Alireza. Now we have short castles and then queen to c7, a good placement for the queen, putting a lot of pressure on that pawn on h2, and white is going to have to be very careful about that. Now, one of the easiest ways to block the pressure is just to go bishop g3 immediately. That is what white does in the game, but real fast, if you don't do that, let's say you go rook to e1 instead, then the idea for black is knight to e4, jumping in with the knight, and taking control of g3 before white can go bishop g3. So, overall point being, if you want to go bishop g3 here, it is important to do it right away, and that is what Magnus does in the game. So, bishop g3 played by Magnus. Now we have bishop takes, h takes, and now a very interesting move by Alireza. He doesn't have to do this, but he's in an enterprising mood. For example, you can't just go, say, short castles or long castles, getting your king to safety, but instead here, Alireza, he busts out the alpha 0 move h5, getting that alpha 0 pawn marching down the board. The idea being potentially, maybe he wants to go h4, sacrificing a pawn, maybe g5, then h4. We'll have to wait and see what he has in mind, and overall, he could be thinking about attacking on the king side. Thanks to this hook on g3, that pawn is vulnerable, and it can be used to blow open the king side. All right, here, Magnus. He's not concerned. Of course, for now, h4 is guarded by the knight. Therefore, black goes h4. Knight takes h4, will win the pawn immediately. That would be perfectly fine for black. Therefore, for white, sorry. Therefore here, Magnus does just go rook to e1, developing his rook on the semi-open e-file. It does belong on e1, And now he's waiting and saying, all right, Alireza, what's it going to be? Do you want to castle long? Do you want to castle short? Do you want to go king to f8, leaving your rook on h8? What's it going to be? Well, for now, Alireza, he's not ready to commit his king just yet. He just goes g6, a very solid move. Now, beyond that, again, there were other options. Castling long and short is playable, but it turns out you actually could go h4 here. The point being, after knight takes, you can just castle long, and having that open h-file could be very useful for black, despite being down a pawn. Now, instead, of course, g6 played in the game, and one of the benefits of this move, you can go, for example, king f8, then king g7, artificially castling your king, and the benefit of that is the rook does stay on h8, where it is potentially very active. Again, the e-file isn't opened up yet for black, therefore having a rook on e8 or f8 wouldn't be very useful. Having it on h8, though, it does keep that option of h4 open later in the game. So, overall, g6, a very flexible move by Alireza. Now, here, Magnus. According to the engine, this move's a little bit weird. The engine says here, as white, you do want to go bishop b5, taking your already developed bishop on e2 and developing it to the b5 square. The point being, you want to take on c6, trying to damage black's pawn structure, and also trying to gain control of that e5 square. For example, the main line goes bishop b5, king to f8, then you take on c6, and then go b4, gaining space. It's all very complicated. Instead of that here, Magnus, he goes for a much simpler option, simply knight to f1, intending perhaps knight to e3, trying to put pressure on that bishop on f5. That, of course, is one of the drawbacks of g6. The bishop on f5 is sort of trapped here. It's got nowhere to go, so knight e3, threatening knight takes f5 could be a very big threat. Now here, Alireza, he continues, knight g4, jumping down with the knight. He's got very aggressive ideas in mind on the king side, and now that pawn on f2 actually could be vulnerable later in the game. It's only supported by the king with the rook on the e1 square, so overall, again, knight takes f2 could be a serious threat. All right, Magnus, he's got nothing to worry about yet. He continues, queen d2, and this is where the game really heats up. Here, Alireza, he plays the man's move, long castles. He's going for it. He wants to attack on the king side, and now, of course, we're going to have the opposite sides castling with opposite side attacks on opposite sides of the board. For example, black here, his plan is simple. g5, h4, blowing open the king side, and white, on the other hand, his plan is simple as well. b4, a4, a5, b5, trying to blow open the queen side. And here, Magnus, he does start the attack right away. b4 is the move, gaining space, threatening a4, a5, then b5, giving the knight nowhere to go on the queen side. All right, Alireza, he continues, king to b8, sliding his king off that semi-open c-file, very important for defensive and maybe even offensive reasons later in the game. He might even want the rook on c8, where it does help pressure that pawn on c3. All right, now Magnus, he's not slowing down. a4 is the move, setting up a5, then b5. That is the right way to continue. If you go b5 too fast, black may go knight to a5, and that a5 square will be an excellent blockading square that has access to c4 if it needs it. So again, you got to go a5 before going b5 when you are expanding in this position. All right, now it turns out the best way for black to continue here, speed is of the essence. It's all about speed. You got to go h4 right here, sacrificing a pawn. The point being, after g takes, you can actually go g5, the second pawn sacrifice, and the computer says this is actually extremely good for black. You're opening up lines, you're setting up rook d to g8 ideas, and that would be the best way forward. Now, instead here, Alireza, he plays the more human-looking move. That is the move f6, Ben Feingold's signature move. The point of this move here, the Ben Feingold counterattack, is simple. Alireza wants to go g5, but without sacrificing the pawn. So g5 is coming next, then maybe h4. Again, he's trying to get his kingside play going as fast as he can. But here, Magnus, he's ready. He does not want to go a5, as then g5 is very strong for black. Instead here, Magnus, the move is knight to, if I can draw the knight to h4, jumping over with the knight. The point being, if you go g5 now, then knight takes f5 does win the bishop, and black will have to damage his pawn structure with the move e takes f5, and that would slow down the attack on the king side. So, Alireza, what is he going to do in response? Well, it turns out he has many good moves. You don't want to go g5 too fast, as again, knight takes f5 would be very, very strong for white. Now, the computer says you can go, for example, knight e7, supporting the bishop, queen d6 is fine, e5, believe it or not, is also playable. Instead here, though, Alireza, he gets a little trigger happy. He does go g5, putting pressure on the knight, and now, of course, the only square for the knight is to capture on f5. Knight takes f5 played in the game. Then we have e takes f5, and then bishop d3, sliding up with the bishop, pressuring the pawn on the f5 square. Overall, white here, his plan is coming together after this wasted move by black, g5. The pawns on the king side are weak. White still has the attack on the queen side with, again, a5, then b5. And Alireza, he is on the back foot. All right, now, how should he continue? Well, again, speed is of the essence. Turns out you have to continue as quickly as possible. For example, f4, h4, and so on are all very, very strong here for black. Instead here, knight to e7 played, supporting that pawn on f5. Now, the knight does defend f5. That is good. However, again, this move is just too slow. You had to continue the attack with f4 or h4 immediately. Now here, Magnus, he continues f3, driving back that knight. The knight goes to h6. Knight to h6 is the move. Then we have rook to e6. Flying in with the rook is Magnus the Goat Carlsen, pressuring f6. And overall, the rook is tremendously active. The follow-up may be rook a to e1, pressuring e7, and so on. And white has complete and total control of the e-file so far. All right, Alireza, how should he defend? Of course, that pawn on f6 is being attacked. You don't want to lose it. In the game, rook h to f8 was played by Alireza, but this turns out to be a slight inaccuracy. Instead, rook to d6, defending along the 6th rank is the move. That way, if rook takes, then you win the rook on f6 right away. That would be the right defensive resource. Now, instead, rook h to f8 played in the game, defending the pawn on f6 with the h rook, now the f rook. But again, this is a little bit too slow, a little bit too passive. And here, Magnus, he has many different ways to proceed. You can go a5 or b5, continuing the attack, or as Magnus did in the game, you can just go rook a to e1, a very simple move, threatening rook takes e7, winning the knight. Again, black is going to have to respond immediately. Now, in the game, knight to c8 was played by Alireza, a decent defensive move, but again, it is a little bit slow, and as we're seeing, Alireza is just totally on the back foot here. That is not what you want in these opposite sides castling games. You want to attack as quickly as possible with everything you've got. And here, Magnus, he is not slowing down. a5 is the move. Marching the alpha 0 a pawn down the board. What is black going to do about it? Well, again, rook d6 is the right defensive resource, intending perhaps rook takes, then knight takes. And there are other playable moves. For example, f4, queen d7, and so on are all playable. Instead here, knight d6 played, and this move might be a little bit weaker as it does occupy the d6 square, stopping rook d6 ideas. Now, d6 overall is decent for the knight, but again, this is a little bit cumbersome. Black's pieces kind of tripping over each other so far. And here, Magnus, he does not miss the opportunity to push the alpha 0 pawn all the way to its final destination, at least for now. He plays the move a6. This is the right way to attack. The point being, you are forcing out very significant weaknesses in the black camp. For example, if you go b6, the light squares around the king will be very, very weak. If you take on a6, white takes back. And again, all these lines are being opened up. White can threaten, for example, c4, b5, b6, and so on. That would be quite dangerous. Now, in the game, he does go b6. That is maybe the lesser of the two evils. But here, Magnus, again, he's going to have a wide variety of ways to increase the pressure. Now, the strongest way to proceed here is just b5, getting a permanent lockdown on those pawns on the queen side. Black's going to have a lot of weaknesses, and beyond that, you are threatening moves like rook to e7 next. Now, instead of that here, Magnus, the GOAT, he does go knight to e3, jumping in with the knight. Now, the point is, you are pressuring d5 and f5, the d5 pawn in particular being super, super weak. That is very troublesome for black. But of course, black's going to have ways to defend. He just slides the queen over. Queen d7, the strongest move, preemptively getting out of the attack of the knight. It turns out, way back in this position here, there's simply no good way to defend that pawn on d5. You can't do it with the queen. Of course, if the queen goes to, say, c6, then b5 would be very strong for white, potentially, as again, the knight on d6 would be pinned to the queen. So, you can't defend with the queen, and if the knight moves back to, say, c8 or e8, that would be just tremendously passive. Yes, the pawn on d5 would be defended, but that would be a death sentence essentially. So instead of that, he goes for the active move queen d7, giving up that pawn on d5, but getting out of the way of the attack by the knight on d5 on the queen on c7 right away. Now we have knight takes d5, and Alireza, to his credit, he finds a brilliant move in this position. He jumps in with the knight to e4. Now, the point of this move, it is not just a suicide knight. If you take the knight, say f takes e4, then the rook on e6 hangs as well. This is the point. The knight on e4 cuts off the communication of these rooks on e6 and e1, a very clever tactical idea. And beyond that, the knight on d5 is also hanging. So here, Magnus, what is he going to do? Well, it turns out he's still doing just fine. The computer says he is, still up at least 2 pawns in this position in terms of relative material strength, right? So, you know what? Good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the beautiful tactical shot for Magnus Carlsen right here in this position. All right, I hope you found it. Here, the key idea for Magnus, of course, is the rook sacrifice. Rook takes b6, giving up the rook for the pawn. What is the idea? Well, it turns out white gets a devastating attack here, as well as the pawn, as well as that knight on e4. So, black goes a takes b6, and now white does take back the knight. F takes e4, winning the knight, and also in the process, defending his own knight on d5. And now, look at this. The alpha 0 a pawn on a6 is unrestricted. It is threatening potentially a7 ideas in the future. This is getting very dangerous for Alireza. All right, now, the computer says the best way to continue is knight to g4. That is the right way forward, but instead here, Alireza in time pressure. It's only got 1 minute and 46 seconds left on the clock versus the 4 minutes and 43 seconds of Magnus. He does go king to a7, blockading that pawn immediately, but now Magnus, he just goes b5. He doesn't miss the chance to play this move, locking down those pawns on the queen side, and now he has that protected passed alpha 0 pawn on a6. That is going to be a massive asset later in this game. All right, here, f takes e4 is the move. Now, bishop takes regains the pawn, and of course, maintains the defense of that knight on the d5 square. Now, we have queen takes b5, winning that free pawn. Then c4, hitting the queen. Where's the queen going to go? Well, it turns out you have many good squares. For example, you can take on a6. That is playable, believe it or not, as rook to a1 is not a real threat yet, as the rook would hang on a1. Besides that, b3 is playable, queen to a4 is playable, and so on. Or the move in the game, queen to a5, sliding over with the queen, hitting the queen on d2, offering the queen trade, and also having that x-ray attack on the rook on e1 behind it. Now, here Magnus, he finds a very beautiful way to continue with the queens on the board. He wants to attack. He wants to win in the middle game. He goes knight to b4, blocking the communication of the queen on a5 with the queen on d2. Very clever, Magnus. I mean, almost as clever as Magnus trying to find some sort of excuse to withdraw from the 2024 World Rapid Chess Championships after he had a very bad showing in day 1 and day 2 of the tournament, but I digress. All right, now, rook to c8 for Alireza, sliding over the rook and pressuring the pawn on the c4 square. Now we have here, white's got a variety of very strong moves. In the game, Magnus did go knight to c6 immediately, and this move, the idea is correct. You are hitting the king and the queen, forcing out rook takes c6, then bishop takes, but it turns out this move here is a little bit dubious. The stronger way to play the idea was actually to go c5 first, and if black takes, then you jump in with the knight to c6. The point being, you do want to open up those lines on the queen side as soon as possible. Now, instead of that here, knight c6 was played immediately by Magnus. Not a bad move per se, but definitely not as precise. Now we have rook takes c6, then queen takes a5, trading the queens, b takes a5, and then bishop takes c6. So now finally, we do have the endgame with the minor piece and the rook for both sides. Let's count the pawns. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns versus the 1, 2, 3, 4 of Alireza. Of course, that pawn on a6 is likely to fall in the near future, but the very important feature of this position, number 1, white has the stronger pieces. The bishop is better than the knight, and the rook's a little more active on e1 than on f8. And very importantly, white has those 2 protected, connected pawns on d4 and c4. White's plan is simple. Push those pawns down the board as quickly as possible, and it will take black a lot more time to get a pass pawn on the king side. All right, now, knight to f5 is the move for Alireza, then d5, starting the march of that pass pawn. Now we have king takes a6, winning that pawn. Now, technically, material is even, but again, Magnus here, he is a little bit faster in this pawn race. Now, c5, then rook d8, defending against the march of the pawns. Now, rook to e6, pressuring the pawn on f6 is Magnus. Now, we have knight d4, pressuring the bishop on c5. Now, bishop to a4 opens up the attack of the rook on the king. The king is under check. It obviously can't go to b5 as the bishop controls that square. Therefore, king to a7 played. Now, rook to e7, sliding up with the rook. King b8, then d6. Now, we have rook c8, rook d4, pressuring that knight on the d4 square. Knight to f5, jumping back with the knight. Now, king to f2, rook takes c5, winning that first pawn, but it is too little, too late. This pawn on d6 is just too powerful. All right, rook e8 hits the king. King b7, now d7. How is black going to stop that pass pawn on the d7 square? It's not going to be easy. Rook d5 is the move. Now, sure enough, d8 promotes to a queen. Black is forced to give up the rook. Rook takes, then rook takes is the move. And here, Alireza Firouzja, he simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. He's got 5 seconds left on the clock versus the 1 minute and 3 seconds to Magnus. And beyond that, obviously, Magnus being up the entire rook here for only 2 pawns. And it's not like those pawns are even remotely close to promoting. And for that reason here, Alireza Firouzja resigns on the spot here in this game to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Alireza Firouzja from this blitz game from February 7th, 2024. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. And by the way, comment down below what you liked or didn't like about this video. And I'd also love to hear your thoughts on the ongoing drama with the 2024 World Rapid Chess Championships. I went on X, Elon Musk's X/Twitter today, and it seems like everyone in the chess world is on Magnus Carlsen's side. All the big influencers, they're all cozying up to Magnus, and I gotta say, I see it a little bit differently. I mean, the last time this happened and it was this big of a deal, it was the 2022 game versus Hans Niemann in the Sinquefield Cup, where Magnus tried to destroy Hans Niemann's career on a baseless accusation, and he, seemingly rightfully got sued for it. So Magnus certainly has a history of being a sore loser and then withdrawing from tournaments, and he happened to have a very bad day 1 and bad day 2. And of course, Magnus and Levi Rosman are going to spin it a certain way, but it certainly looks like he's just being a sore loser after having a bad day 1 and bad day 2, and he was looking for an excuse to withdraw. By the way, he was not booted from the tournament. He simply completely voluntarily withdrew himself from the tournament. He was allowed to come back on day 3 and play in the blitz if he just changed his attire, his jeans, whatever, and he refused to do that. Again, his ego being hurt, I guess, by day 1 and by day 2 with how it went, and then, the rest is history. So I don't really think Magnus is in the right in this one. I think he's being a sore loser. He kind of has this habit of being a sore loser, and, Hans Niemann posted sort of a cryptic message on X about this, and I think Hans Niemann honestly is in the right. I think this is just Magnus and his ego being burst a little bit, but I'm still a Magnus fan, still like the guy. It's just bizarre to me how no one in the chess world is simply able to say what they see in front of them, which is Magnus having a bad day 1, a bad day 2, violating the dress code, not being booted from the tournament, and then he voluntarily decides to leave the tournament, leaving chess fans all over the world shaking their heads like, come on, Magnus, what are you doing? So anyway, that is just my opinion. Comment down below what you think. This is my opinion again, so is what it is. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Alireza action, check out this game right here where Magnus busts out the Alekai's defense against Alireza. He plays a very fast G5 advance in that game. It was a wild game. You want to see a wild Magnus versus Alireza game, check that out. You'll love it, and I'll see you in the next video.